It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. As Russia attacks Kyiv directly, President Trump launches another scathing attack on President Zelensky, saying he's being very harmful to peace talks. Energy Secretary Ed Miliband is hosting a summit on energy security today in London.
Homegrown low-carbon power is our nationally chosen route to energy security. Solar power, wind power, tidal, geothermal, nuclear power, also an essential part of the low-carbon opportunity.
Is the government getting closer to agreeing a youth mobility scheme with the EU?
We hadn't got freedom anymore, not truly. We were limited to the 4 counties that he was excluded from.
And we speak to this campaigner who wants to change the rules on where some offenders can live and work after being released from prison. Joining us today, Labour MP Rosie Wrighting, Conservative peer Craig McKinley, Green Party co-leader Adrian Ramsey and Emma Revel from the centre-right think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies. This is Politics Live. Let's start with the outburst from President Trump. Let's have a look at some of the front pages that have been covering it. The Times says, Zelensky is key obstacle to peace deal, says Trump. Followed by the Daily Mail, back my peace or lose all of Ukraine, Trump warns. In The Guardian, the headline is Crimea is lost, says Trump as he warns Zelensky on peace deal. And finally, in the Daily Telegraph, Trump to let Putin keep seized land. Well, overnight there have been attacks, as you heard in the headlines, in Ukraine. The BBC News says Zelensky cancels part of South Africa trip after deadliest Russian attack on Kyiv since July. Yes, there was a massive drone and missile attack on Kyiv directly. We can see some of the images of the devastation there because 9 people at least were killed and dozens injured, and you can see the fallout from that attack overnight. Well, there was an urgent question in the House of Commons literally within the last hour or so. Foreign Office Minister Stephen Doughty said this.
The UK's position regarding Ukrainian sovereignty is well known, and our position has not changed, and we do not recognise Russian sovereignty over any territory illegally seized from Ukraine, including Crimea. And when, how and on what terms this war comes to an end can only be decided by negotiations with Ukraine at the heart of them.
The UK standing firmly behind Ukraine and President Zelensky and saying no land should be ceded to Russia before there is an agreed ceasefire. Do you agree still with that position, Rosie?
Absolutely. Keir Starmer has shown real leadership in this area, bringing together the coalition of the willing and making sure that we support Ukraine. There is no peace in Ukraine without Ukraine being around the table, and it's absolutely vital at a time like this that we continue to support them.
The issue is, of course, that J.D. Vance, the Vice President, Craig McKinley, in America, has said that actually America might walk away from this conflict and continued talks unless President Zelensky agrees to a peace deal.
Well, I have to say what Keir Starmer has done so far, I'm generally quite supportive of. I think he's shown quite good leadership on the world stage. But to think that Europe and the UK or the coalition of the willing can do this alone, I'm afraid is fanciful. We have to have US support in whatever the final solution might be. But we have to have grave concerns about Trump almost considering Zelensky being the bogeyman in this deal rather than the true one, which is Putin. And, those bombs that have been raining down at high level in Kyiv just yesterday is not the usual activity of a glide path to peace. But I have to say, realistically, Europe and UK operating as partners on trying to maintain whatever peace might come, I'm afraid is not muscular enough. I'm concerned that the US are holding the cards on this, but I'm afraid that is the real politic of the international world. Right, but should the UK move their position and start putting more pressure on President Zelensky to come closer to what's being offered? No, I think we have a problem that the whole of the Sebastopol-type region, Crimea region, is sort of treated differently by most everybody. And when we have to ask ourselves, why did we do nothing in 2014? We did nothing. So I almost have to say, it's almost given away by the international community, and I sadly think that that is where the final outcome will rest.
Oh, do you agree with that? I mean, should the UK now take a slightly different position in terms of reaching any sort of deal and ceasefire?
Well, we absolutely need to have a peace, and it's got to be a sustained and negotiated peace. So we must have an end to the slaughter, to the devastation that we're seeing in Ukraine, but it's got to be an end that's going to properly last and that's going to be a fair deal for the people of Ukraine. And I'm really fed up with President Trump's bullying tactics towards Zelensky. We need to do more as a country to stand up to Trump and make sure that Ukraine gets a fair deal, because otherwise...
What is that fair deal? I mean, if we have a look at what President Trump said, or part of what he said on Truth Social, he is talking about the fact that Ukraine, as he sees it, will not legally recognise the occupation of Crimea. As you say, it happened in the annexation in 2014. But he goes on to say, we are very close to a deal, but the man with no cards to play, President Zelensky, should now finally get it done and stop the killing field.
Well, of course it's got to be negotiated, but that involves everyone being around the table and the rights of Ukrainians being protected. And we have to remember we've still got a situation where children from Ukraine are being abducted by Russia, nearly 20,000 abducted now, forced to live in Russia, in some cases to fight against Ukraine. So this is not an even-handed situation, it's a terrible situation, and we've got to make sure Ukraine gets a fair deal out of the negotiations.
Well, whatever a fair deal may look like, Emma, should the UK government continue to oppose any attempt to hand over Ukrainian territory to Russia before agreeing a ceasefire?
I think it's up to Ukraine to decide if they want to hand over territory. I think privately Zelensky quite possibly does recognise he may have to make some concessions. He won't want to, of course, and the Ukrainian people won't want him to either. But if that does open up a path to peace, he would, presumably privately accept that that's something that may have to happen. The problem is he's getting no respect from Trump at all. He's being told he is the problem. Trump is not recognising in any way that Russia has any culpability for this. And he said, I'm finding it difficult to negotiate with Zelensky. Well, of course you are, because you're not negotiating with Russia or with Putin. You're giving them everything they want. You're not holding them accountable for anything. Of course you're finding them the easier partner to deal with.
Let's talk about the energy summit that you heard about in the headlines. Yes, it's a big meeting in London today on energy security, being hosted by the Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband. Well, let's have a listen to him and the idea of making Britain less reliant on imported sources of energy. Here's what he had to say.
Now, oil and gas, including from our North Sea, will continue to play an important role in our energy system, and we really value our industry and the jobs it supports. But as with many other countries, we're a price taker, not a price maker in international fossil fuel markets. So our vision of low-carbon power goes well beyond the climate imperative, important as that is. Homegrown low-carbon power is our nationally chosen route to energy security.
Craig, do you agree with Ed Miliband?
I'd say I don't agree with one word that Ed Miliband ever says. I listened to his Radio 4 this morning. It was a total car crash with Justin Webb. He was trying to defend the price of electricity in the UK, which is indefensible. And we wonder why we have a steel crisis. We wonder why Stoke potteries are now being exported abroad, why every single high-energy business is abandoning the UK. He wants local or domestic energy security. I want that. But that is not achieved by importing vast amounts of gas that he's just accepted that we will be using for a long time, importing it from places like Qatar, the US, even as far away as LNG came in from Australia last year. I mean, frankly, if we keep this importation of fundamental energy needs, we're going to run out of football clubs to sell Qatar before too long, because we could have this as local energy, i.e. domestic gas, which we're going to use, and then as we move in the longer term to nuclear. That has got to be the pathway, not almost sort of 15th century windmills that are completely unreliable. I mean, this is a hopeless policy.
I think we inherited a system, an energy crisis.
I agree, it was rubbish. It was rubbish. I agree with that. I've been fighting against it when I was in the governing party.
And my constituents, whether it's households or businesses, had to pay the price of international energy price hikes, and it has meant that people haven't felt comfortable to invest because they're worried about the bills that might come at the end of
Rosie,
the month.
how
the
is
way
it?
out of this is by investment in clean energy, and also you need to recognise the jobs that that brings to the UK as well. We've already seen international investment because of the decisions that Ed Miliband has made, and thousands of jobs created on the back of it. This is not just about energy prices, it's also about national security.
Can I just give you a
investing in the
little
UK.
fact of life on this? Britain has got probably more renewables than most countries apart from Denmark. Which two countries on this planet have the two most expensive electricity prices? Britain and Denmark.
But that's
they
because
go
we've been-
hand in hand.
That's because of the international
No,
prices.
Germany relies on gas and coal for its energy, for its electricity production. It's cheaper than ours. So they don't seem to be suffering from this so-called high international gas price. How is it, when I look at my bill at home, my gas is 5.5 pence a kilowatt hour. So for the oomph of what I want is 5.5 pence a kilowatt hour. My electricity is 28 pence a kilowatt hour. So there is not a gas price crisis.
And Rosie,
the
Ed
crisis
Miliband
is electricity, one of our own
that
making.
bills would come down.
Yes, and we've committed to that, getting to net
When?
zero by 2030 and getting energy bills down by £300. That is something we've committed to. This is something this government has acted on absolute pace on. We set up Great British Energy within our first 100 days. It's one of our clear missions. For the sake of my constituents, I want to get those energy prices down, and because of the decisions of this government, that is what will happen.
We've had two price changes by Ofgem since you've been in power. They've both put the prices
because of
up.
what we inherited from the previous Conservative government.
Which you've accepted.
It was appalling, so don't do more of the same.
Let me bring in Adrian Ramsey. Is Ed Miliband right, and is Rosie right? Embracing low carbon power is the best route. We'll come on to pricing in a minute, to energy self-sufficiency.
Yes, I agree with Rosie that we absolutely need to step up renewable energy in the UK. Renewable energy is the cheapest way of producing electricity. It makes us more resilient. It makes us more jobs rich as a country. It helps bring bills down. And
Craig doesn't
Adrian, you know that is untrue. That is untrue what you've just said.
Craig talks about gas prices, but the fact is that gas is sold on the international markets. And not only that, but the price of gas is coupled in with the price of electricity. So you push up the price of electricity by coupling them together. That needs to be addressed. But it's
so bills are going up at the moment, aren't they?
Well, and that's because whilst I support some aspects of what the government's doing, it isn't a rounded enough approach. There isn't, for example, enough focus on reducing energy use. Programmes like a nationwide programme to insulate people's homes so we can reduce energy use, bring bills down. And there's other areas of Labour policy like expanding airports, for example, and considering whether they're going to allow the Rosebank oil field in Scotland that would completely bust every carbon benefit of all of Labour's national clean power.
Honestly, do you think we've got a CO2 barrier around this country? As you export a high-energy business from this country and you then just remake it abroad, usually in China, on the back of cheap coal, and then stick it on a diesel ship to come back to the UK, do you think that's a CO2 saving? Or is that just a CO2 sham?
Well, it's absolutely right that under economic globalisation we've exported a lot of our emissions. That's why I'm arguing for a lot more domestic manufacturing, and that can be of things like heat pumps, wind turbines, trains. There's huge jobs opportunities here with the green economy, and in the wake of the steel crisis and President Trump throwing his weight around on tariffs, we've absolutely got to grasp these opportunities and make us more resilient on manufacturing and on farming as well. And these are crucial to making sure we can adapt to the changes in the climate.
You probably agree with covering farming land with more and more acres of solar panels that have been made in China on the back of cheap coal. I mean, it's a nonsense.
Well, although not in your constituency.
Oh no, not in here, not in mine.
What I
I
want to see is a proper strategy that ensures we deliver both energy security and food security. And I don't see that from the government at the moment. Looking at what land do we need to deliver both those things together?
Well, I'll come to that contradiction, perhaps at the heart, as you're saying, of what Labour and what the government is doing. But Emma, on that, how much of this should be about trying to convince people to just use less energy as well as low carbon power?
I think it can be part of the message, but I think that's honestly going to be a struggle. I think if you try and tell people, you know, do you support decarbonisation without a timescale? Yes, absolutely. If you say to people, actually, we want you to cut down on the meat you eat, the foreign holidays you take and turn your heating off, absolutely that's not going to have public support at all. So the decarbonisation journey needs to have significant buy-in from the public. Now, the examples I gave are a bit dramatic. No one's suggesting we do those tomorrow. But they are things that are talked about when we talk about reducing our carbon footprint and reducing energy usage. So as much as the public think that's a possibility, they're never going to buy into it, and it diminishes decarbonisation as a whole.
Right, they're never going to buy into it, Adrian.
Well, what's interesting about that is if you look at studies about how much public support is there for different environmental measures, it's always higher than people think that the level of public support actually is.
But there's a difference between asking someone, do you think this is a good idea, and are you going to do it? Because if they're not going to do it, it doesn't matter how much they think it sounds like a nice idea.
But that assumes
they actually rather go off the boil.
But that assumes the onus is on the individual, doesn't it? And the onus can't be on the individual. So if, for example, I want to say that I want to see more people take the train, say, from London to Edinburgh than fly, I'm not just going to say every individual must do that. I'm going to say it's got to be cheaper to take the train than to fly. It's the wrong way round at the moment. The environmental choice has got to be the cheaper and easier choice, and the policy incentives don't set that up.
Let's get to the cheaper and easier choice, Adrian, because what about, as Craig was saying, having nuclear? And Ed Miliband is saying, as well as renewable sources of energy, he wants to have nuclear as part of the future energy mix. Do you agree with that?
Well, nuclear is going to be part of the energy mix for some time because we've got existing nuclear power stations.
4 out of 5 of which are set to go offline in the life of this
The
Parliament.
question is, what's the best way to do new energy production? And we've got to address this quickly, and nuclear takes a very long time to come about. It will be well over a decade for any new nuclear power station to produce energy, and that money will have significant public funds will have a far bigger impact far more quickly invested in renewables and in energy efficiency.
Right, Rosie?
I want to pick up on what Adrian said as well about British supply chains, because it is what Ed Miliband's announcements today are actually patriotic. We need to invest in British supply chains. We're seeing an ever-changing world and quite a scary world at the moment, and we need to know that we are in a position to be self-sufficient.
Yeah. And at what cost? At what price? Are you being honest with people about how
much the price of not doing it?
What would that be? Would that be even higher then?
Absolutely, because we've seen what happened to energy prices when Russia invaded Ukraine. We've seen world conflicts. Yep, because of the decisions of the previous government meant that we are...
Because you're putting more renewables in. It'll go up and up and up. No. Because we haven't got the real price of renewables factored in yet. The price of renewables that everyone says when it's cheap is when you've got perfect wind on a perfect day and it's perfectly used by everybody.
It's more than
on the day that the wind doesn't blow, that is when you've got the real cost. So you've got to either buy batteries, you've either got to create new reservoirs so you can have hydropower, or you start creating hydrogen. All of this stuff has not been factored in yet in the true cost of renewables, because all we're seeing is it's great when it blows, when it doesn't, someone else's fault, we have to turn the gas on.
Rosie, convince Craig.
I mean, first of all, it's not just about when the wind blows. I think that's making it sound very simplistic for what is...
One thing I know about solar is it does turn off at night. Let's agree on that one, shall we?
Yeah, no, so we need to have multiple sources of renewables, and we need to invest in multiple sources of renewables so that we're protected in all different climates and all different weather, and that's including solar, that's including offshore, onshore wind as well. It's including carbon capture. In this, there's multiple...
Can I just honestly, I think we need a bit of lesson here. The carbon capture plan, £22 billion of taxpayers' money, hoped for £8 billion of private money, £30 billion to sequester 8 million tonnes of carbon a year. Do you know what 8 million tonnes of carbon a year is? Can I tell you what
jobs that it brings? And also the jobs that it brings, the international investment
make jobs up if you throw taxpayer money at
economy. Because of the decisions Ed Miliband has made, there is investment coming into the UK. If we did what you were doing, we would see that investment. So my constituents
let me develop
would be worse
this fact of life about sequestering carbon with £30 billion. 8 million tonnes is one power station. China makes one power station a week. This £30 billion would sequester the incremental output of 1 week of China.
All right, but then,
it's
Craig, that you then want to just rely forevermore on fossil fuels?
No, I want to get towards a proper nuclear economy. But even Ed Miliband and certainly the Greens, nuclear is still deemed a little bit too dirty.
Let's pick
for
up
us.
what Craig said on carbon capture, because actually it is the case that around the country, around the world, the vast majority of carbon capture and storage plants that have been commissioned have later been abandoned. There's no proven usage of this technology. We do have genuine natural carbon capture and storage, restoring trees, woodlands, peatlands, wetlands, and the nature restoration side of the climate needs to happen far more.
And that's why we've announced new reservoirs, new national forests.
That does need to happen more. But actually, if we look at the debate that Craig and Rosie were just having, one big thing that was missed from that is how we reduce energy use. We're not going to solve... There's no model for net zero that doesn't include significant measures to reduce energy use, and that's why I'm arguing for a nationwide programme for home insulation, which could keep homes warm, keep
Other
bills
governments
down
have tried
as well.
to do it. It's amazing that it hasn't
not
been picked
thoroughly.
up well, or thoroughly, or perhaps not without enough subsidy. I mean, I don't know the answer, but let me just show you this headline, Emma. BBC News: Ed Miliband considering regional energy pricing. We spent a bit of time trying to get to the bottom of exactly what this means. He was speaking to the BBC and others and was asked about the idea of so-called zonal pricing following this headline in today's Telegraph. Miliband poised to charge homes in South more for electricity. Zonal pricing will create a postcode lottery and deter investment. Now, he said that report was copper-bottomed nonsense. However, he did say the Energy Secretary was considering the idea of cheaper bills for homes near certain types of infrastructure, such as new pylons or nuclear power stations. Would that be a good idea?
I think given we have significant problems in this country and have had for decades at getting infrastructure of any kind built, saying to homeowners, if we build something like this in your community, it will have a direct financial benefit for you, your bills will be lower. I think that's a great way to incentivise infrastructure.
Right.
What I'm interested in is Ed Miliband saying, we're considering zonal pricing, but I don't want it to be a postcode lottery. Because that, I don't know how you square that circle. That is, by definition, what zonal pricing is.
Right. Adrian, do you like the idea of people being charged less if they live near infrastructure, energy infrastructure?
Well, there's two different questions here, aren't they? On the zonal pricing...
Well, leave that just for one side. But on that,
yes.
If you've got a pylon near you or a nuclear power plant, for example, should you pay less for your energy?
I think that should be part of the mix, yes. But if you look at the detail of what needs to happen, what's proposed for compensation, thinking of my constituency, for example, is there going to be adequate compensation for farmers who are deeply impacted, for other households that are deeply impacted by energy infrastructure routes? I haven't yet seen the detail of what's proposed beyond this sort of blanket reduction in bills.
But
what about the impact
in your constituency, for example?
Well, that's why I'm interested in the detail. What will it mean for farmers in my constituency who are impacted in terms of the detail of the compensation?
Right. Although how else will that cheap electricity be transported across constituencies?
Well, of course it needs to be transported. There are different ways of doing it. There's debates around the country about whether it's overground, underground. In fact, in other parts of the UK, it's been done offshore. And interestingly,
I think the conclusion has been that is the cheapest way to do it. Otherwise, they would have done the underground.
Lincolnshire and East Anglia have been left out of the offshore route that should have been happening under the last government and didn't happen under this one.
If there was
there's now
a scheme,
debate over whether it's over the ground or underground.
But if there was a scheme that charged people less, let's say your constituents, for living next to a pylon, would you support pylons?
Well, I think if that's what the government's going to do, there's got to be proper compensation. Look, there's a genuine debate, and it's a cross-party debate, actually. All four parties are represented on this in East Anglia, looking at what's the best way of doing the connectivity. We've absolutely got to do the connectivity of renewable energy infrastructure, and there needs to be a calm discussion about the best way to do that looks at timescales, looks at costs, looks at impacts on nature and community.
There's a lot of detail, obviously, to be done. In principle, do you think it's a good idea Ed Miliband should get on with it?
Well, like I said, we haven't seen the details of this.
But broadly, you pay less if you live near a pylon or a nuclear power plant.
I think that people should absolutely see the benefit of the infrastructure that they might actually be able to see out of their bedroom window, quite literally. I think it also means that people can have pride in what their community, county, town is contributing to our net zero targets as well. And it's a part of being, patriotic and seeing the benefits of the infrastructure right outside your room.
Well, that might be one way of getting your bills down.
You've got it wrong on this. This is not about if you live near a pylon. This is about demand management.
No, but hang on.
This is
separate things.
No, this is about demand. No, this is wholly about demand management.
So you think Ed Miliband?
No, let me tell you how it works. Let me tell you how it works. you have got a surfeit of offshore wind in parts of the country where you haven't got an awful lot of take-up of that locally produced electricity. So the idea is that us in the south, not too much offshore wind, but high demand, you will pay a lot more for your electricity to try and suppress our demand, whilst those who live near the offshore wind off of Scotland, for instance, will get cheaper electricity because the electricity grid is way behind the rollout of new renewables.
Right.
This is a stitch and mend of a failed energy policy.
It is a postcode lottery.
Well, let me tell you this.
Well,
I pay the same. I pay the same for my BBC licence wherever I live in the country. I think you same pretty much for a McDonald's anywhere in the country. Are we really saying we're going to have different electricity pricing? And that's a way forward. It's madness.
It's important to acknowledge,
Rosie.
we said we want to get energy bills down across the country. If a certain community benefits because there is an infrastructure closer to them, it doesn't mean that we're not benefiting as a nation and other households maybe not as close to that infrastructure aren't benefiting as well. This government is going to get energy bills down across the country, which the Conservatives failed to do.
All right, record that and hold you to it. That's what
You can come back on again, the two of you. Let's show you this headline in The Guardian. Labour MPs urge Starmer to back youth mobility scheme amid EU trade reset. You've heard a lot about the resetting of relations on Politics Live. More than 60 MPs signed a letter calling for time-limited visas for 18 to 30-year-olds to travel freely. Let's talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman. Henry, what are these MPs calling for precisely?
Well, they are calling for an agreement with the EU, which would mean that young people, probably under 30s, would be able to travel much more freely between the UK and EU countries, but with two important caveats. They say that the number who could come to the UK would have to be capped with a quota, and that it would have to be time limited, i.e. they would only be able to come to the UK, and vice versa, of course, for a certain defined period of time. This is really interesting because this is something that the EU has made clear it wants to get from the UK as part of this broader reset, which is beginning to harden into something concrete. We don't know exactly what yet, but we do think there is going to be a deal of sorts between the UK and the European Commission at a summit here in the UK in a few weeks' time. And I think the fact that a deal that looks a bit like this on mobility, migration is not at all being ruled out by the UK government is pretty telling.
Right, you talked about those two caveats. The numbers would have to be capped and it would have to be time limited. Is that to insulate the government from accusations that they're returning to freedom of movement?
Yeah, exactly that. And I think also it is a key difference with freedom of movement. But of course, the question of how long people can come to the UK for and for what purpose and in what numbers is going to be massively significant because certainly those who don't want a return to free movement, and Keir Starmer has ruled out any return to full free movement, well, they would say, you know, the problem wasn't just the concept, the problem was the numbers of people who came to the UK. So I think, you know, we always say this with any policy, but it's really true here. You know, the devil will be in the detail, not just in terms of what it means for people here in the UK, but also in terms of what the political implications will be for a Labour government, which, let's remember, has vowed to reduce net migration.
Henry Zeffman, thank you very much. Are you going to sign up to this letter, Rosie?
I haven't signed the letter personally, but No, I haven't. I haven't.
And you won't?
No, no. I will not be. I haven't signed the letter, and I won't be signing the letter. I think, as we said, the devil will be in the detail. We don't have the details of talks that are going on with the EU at the moment, but the government has set out its red lines around free movement. We were elected on those red lines as well. I also think it's important to acknowledge that, and I sit on a Business and Trade Select Committee, and we've released a report about resetting our relationship with the UK and EU, but how damaged that relationship was because of the decisions of the previous government.
Do you support the idea of a youth mobility scheme?
The details of the negotiation haven't come out yet, and we will hear about those in Parliament. And I think it's important that we talk about that in Parliament, cross-party as well.
But they're the details. But in principle, I mean, you're probably... you would benefit from it, Rosie.
Yes.
You have the benefit of great youth, I mean, as you all do, but under 30, you would benefit from it. Can you see the benefits?
I think that it's important, and what the government is doing is any negotiation that we have with the EU at the moment is absolutely in our national interest, and we'll get the deals of negotiations that come out. But we have our red lines on this, and that's what we were elected on.
Is it a good idea, a youth mobility scheme with the EU?
I think it depends on how long it's for. If it's sort of, you can come for 3 months, well, that's a holiday, you can come anyway. If you can come for 2 years, that's migration, and the public will have concerns about that.
Where's your line on what is and isn't migration or freedom of movement then? A year?
6 months to a year, I would imagine. If that was the limit, the public would not see that as migration per se. But even then, if you're coming for up to a year, you need somewhere to live. We have a housing crisis. That's one of the reasons that people are particularly concerned about migration. I think one of the biggest challenges that Keir Starmer faces with this programme is actually the fact that what could happen is British youths could see it's actually a lot cheaper, a lot sunnier, a lot nicer to go live in somewhere like Portugal, which is, because of a demographic crisis that they have, as many Western countries do, you can get up to 100% tax breaks if you're an entrepreneur and a young person and want to go set up your business in Portugal.
So it would be good for UK youth then?
Yeah, but probably not great for Britain.
Right. I mean, what do you think? A youth mobility scheme, for the reasons that Emma has just outlined, it sounds rather lovely.
I think it would be a really positive thing. Since Brexit, so many young people have missed out on the opportunities to work, travel, spend time in different European countries with all of the cultural, personal, economic benefits that brings. And this would be a step back towards that, and I think it'd be really positive. We saw last year Labour and the Conservatives both opposing EU proposals on this, but the fact that more Labour MPs are now lobbying on it, I think, is a good thing.
Right. I mean, what about 2 years, let's say? Would you support that? Go a bit further than perhaps the government would?
Well, I think it could be. I think we have lost a lot in clamping down on opportunities to live, work, study in different countries around Europe. People who've got family in different countries have lost opportunities to go on extended visits and spend time with their loved ones. So I think certainly there is a big opportunity here that we need to grasp.
Right.
I think, just on the back of that as well, when we talk about migration, what the Conservatives failed to do, it's really important that we bring skills into that conversation as well, because we do have a skills shortage in the UK. So knowing that if people do come here, that they're contributing positively to our economy and our skills.
We have a housing shortage too, certainly a crisis at the moment. It's not freedom of movement, is it, Craig McKinley? Because those caveats that we just heard, the numbers would be capped and it would be time limited in some way. It's true we don't know what the detail may be, and they haven't signed up to it, of course. Yet, what about it?
I think we need to be very concerned about this broader reset, what it means. We've got a very, very strange bill being through the Lords at the Commons end at the moment, the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill, which is the most broad Henry VIII powers of any bill I've seen in my time here, allows copying of any EU legislation by a statutory instrument by a minister. Predominantly to get us back in line with the EU. We've got a strange negotiation where we're giving up fish, likely, so that we can be part of looking after EU defence. I mean, you couldn't make this up, but it's the same civil servants and the same Sir Keir Starmer who for 48 times during the Brexit war years of 16 to 19 tried to derail the whole of Brexit. But on the youth mobility, you might be surprised to hear, I'm quite relaxed about it. We have a youth mobility scheme with Japan, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Canada, and strangely with Uruguay. I don't really know much about the Uruguay arrangement, but if it apes that, I'm quite comfortable with it. My concerns are
the reset.
It may be broader than this, and the UK taxpayer ends up giving subsidised education to EU citizens and all those irrecoverable student debts, of which I asked a question about in Parliament.
Well, what about the reset and the concerns that Craig has just outlined? Is he right to be worried?
I think what Craig should be worried about is the deal that we inherited from the Conservative government, and the fact that they completely shut the door on any talks with our close trading allies in the EU. And businesses in my constituency felt the repercussions of a bad deal, and a deal that was not done with the proper diplomacy. We have a chance to reset a relationship. And
do you know why that negotiation was so tough? Was because of people like Ben and Keir Starmer made the passage of Brexit so complex that we ended up with, frankly, a little bit of a fist-handed deal. We really did.
It's because the Conservative Party chose political headlines over working in the UK's national interest.
You do realise, don't you, that if we end up with too cosy a deal with the EU, it could completely block international trade deals. And they will say, well, you're not free enough to do a trade deal. CPTPP, the new deal, which gives us access to 500 million new people.
But there isn't a suggestion of rejoining the EU from the government.
If you become too close, you've got nothing to offer.
We've been very, very clear on our red lines. We set this out in the election and we've stood by that as well. But in an ever-changing, challenging world, we absolutely need to have a positive relationship for the EU,
so
for the sake of our security.
You want to join Germany that's now in massive recession. I mean, this is the politics of madness. No. You join up when you have new trade deals with growing parts of the world. You don't do it with bits of the world that are
constituency felt the repercussions of the bad Brexit deal. Multiple businesses that trade in and out in the UK. And I've spoken.
Hang on.
Shirley, Craig, in an era of President Trump throwing his weight around and potential tariff and trade wars, it makes sense for us to strengthen our trading relationships with our nearest trading partners.
Well, I say with everyone. I'd agree with everyone. Yeah.
So you want to see more trade and more closer relationships with Europe there?
Right, but... Yeah.
Well, of course, I want more trade with the Pacific Rim. I want more trade with the US. I want more trade with our traditional Canadian, Australian markets as well.
What would have to be given by the UK in order to get that trade deal? Well, I mean, you're relaxed, you say, about a mobility scheme, but what else would have to be given in order for the EU?
We don't know the details of that negotiation. We've heard that it's...
Well, you must have an opinion.
Hang on, let her finish.
I don't think it's helpful while trade deals are ongoing for comments from politicians of what we think might be in it or won't be in it. I don't think that's helpful.
It never stopped me from doing so when I was an MP.
Less of that, less said about that, the better. Just worried, you haven't signed the letter. Is that because you and your constituents are worried about the issue of immigration and more people coming to the country?
I think that... Yeah, there's a genuine concern about immigration, and I think that does need to be acknowledged as well. And like I just spoke about, we need to talk about immigration and skills and make sure that immigration is positive immigration and it's contributing to our economy as well. And yeah, I don't think it's helpful to speculate on deals that haven't happened.
All right, well, let's have a look at this headline on a completely different subject. Killers and stalkers should live in restricted zones, say victims. This is a proposal that people who have been convicted of crimes like murder, manslaughter or stalking should be required to live in specific areas after their release from prison on licence. We can talk to Rhiannon Bragg in Gwynedd in North Wales. She's campaigning for the law to change after she was stalked and held at gunpoint for 8 hours by her ex-partner. Welcome to you, Rhiannon. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're proposing?
Absolutely. So my own situation was that following an abusive relationship, as you said, I was stalked for several months and then held hostage at gunpoint. And following that, I, in my naivety, thought that I would be kept safe by the criminal justice system. And it was only when that process really started that I realised how far from the truth that was. The perpetrator was sentenced to 9.5 years, 4.5 years in custody, and then released on a 5-year licence. That was when I realised the clock was ticking for us, and that part of that licence would be, and I'd hope from, we were lucky enough to get an exclusion zone. The exclusion zone was told to me because I signed up to the victim contact scheme the day before he was released. And I was allowed to share as well with the local community that he was excluded from, part of the region he was excluded from, which is very much a reflection of the fact that with these perpetrators, it's rarely one victim.
What about...
So what I'm asking for is... Sorry.
Let's go on. No, you go ahead. What are you asking for?
So what I'm asking for is, instead of the situation where currently victims are encircled in exclusion zones, that actually the perpetrator is encircled in an inclusion zone. It's something that would stop limiting the liberty and freedom of victims and look at actually limiting the offender, the people who've committed these crimes.
What impact did it have on you to use those terms, that you felt limited, clearly, or perhaps you were worrying about running in to your former abuser if you went outside the safe zone?
That's exactly how it felt. Once I crossed the exclusion zone, I felt incredibly exposed, incredibly at risk. You know, how quickly would other police forces react? How would he behave? Who else may intervene if he was there? And the flip is, when you cross back into the exclusion zone, there's some sort of feeling of safety. But that's wrong. It keeps you in a super high state of anxiety, and that in itself is limiting. It limits how victims are able to heal from the trauma that's caused by these offenders and the offences they commit.
We've got MPs here in the studio, Rhiannon. Let's get some reaction. What do you think about that idea, inverting it, in other words, Rosie?
Well, first of all, Rhiannon, I want to say how much I admire you for using your story to campaign for change. I think stalking is not talked about enough. The effects of stalking are not talked about enough. And before we even get to the point where we're looking at offenders, there's not enough justice that is brought for stalking victims. And this government is aware of that and has tightened up legislation so there are more convictions. As you can see, I'm a young woman in public office, and even in my short time in this role, I've dealt with things which I can't even imagine having what you've gone through, but dealt with, you know, small versions of this, and it's been terrifying. It really has.
And would you support this particular idea of having the perpetrators or former offenders living in a restricted zone?
I think it's a conversation that needs to be had. I think that, you know, case-by-case basis this probably needs to be looked at, because it's also important to acknowledge that stalking isn't necessarily in person, it's also online. But what does need to happen is victims of stalking need to be able to live safely, freely, after they've gone through such an ordeal.
Adrian, would you support what Rhiannon is trying to do?
Well, first of all, Rhiannon, thank you very much for sharing your experience with us. Sounds like a horrific experience that we all have to take extremely seriously. Violence against women and girls is on the rise, and we have to tackle it as a society. I think, like Rosie, I think there's a lot to be said for what you're highlighting. It needs to be considered properly by MPs, but I think it needs to be looked at in terms of how the initial sentencing is done, whether you would build something like that in from the beginning. I had a constituent recently where her perpetrator from a serious domestic violence case was going to be released early under the early release scheme. We managed to get the Justice Department to stop that because it was not supposed to be done under that scheme. But I saw through that case that she, like you, was deeply worried, and we've got to build this into the way sentencing's done, as well as making sure that local authorities are properly funded for supporting domestic violence centres.
Right. I mean, Rhiannon, you yourself have spoken to Government. Ministry of Justice spokesperson said victims must feel safe, which is why any offenders released on licence who break the rules face going back to prison. They have to follow strict conditions such as curfews and exclusion zones. What was your response to that? Do you think they're taking on board what you're saying?
My response to the Ministry of Justice quote is how to let everybody know how deeply insulting that is to hear as a victim. It's great they're going to send these people back to prison when they have broken their licence conditions, but can you imagine what might have happened to the victim by then? It could well be too late. And I absolutely hear budgetary concerns. We're fully aware of that. I strongly suspect that this would actually be a cheaper way of managing offenders, both for police and for probation. There's technology already in existence. And I should clarify as well, my experience was of stalking and partner stalking, but actually this isn't just about stalkers. It's about people, it's about murderers, manslaughter, it's about bereaved families. You've talked about the impact on victims, and I think that's something which is still really not terribly deeply understood. There's been so much learning recently, in the last few years, more learning about that sort of thing. And yes, I took this to Westminster with my MP, Liz Saville-Roberts, who's been supportive of this idea. And one of the things that was flagged up, which won't be a surprise to anyone sitting with you today, was that the perpetrator has rights. And it's something which, from a victim's point of view, is unpleasant to hear.
Right.
I appreciate that there's a legal hurdle. It needs to be addressed.
Right. What's wrong with the idea, Emma?
I can completely understand calls for it. It's a very emotive subject, and in the case of stalking, it's the psychological impact and the fear, as Rhiannon said.
But it isn't just stalking, but yeah.
Well, indeed, but if it's the fear of bumping into an offender when you leave your home, whether that's a killer or a stalker, that's completely real and terrifying. But I have to question the logistics of this, if you're going to have a defined area where an offender can live, where is that area? How far away does it need to be? What do the people who live in that area feel? Going, oh, well, this killer has to live near you, not near somebody else. And ultimately, if someone is still a danger, why aren't they still in prison?
Very briefly.
Yeah, Rhiannon, I mean, what you've suffered is the tail end of decades of failure, where we talk about victims' rights. Parliament has talked about victims' rights through the last Labour government, all the way through my government, and now this Labour government. It's all, yeah, they talk victim, but they don't actually mean it. We've also got a whole industry surrounding the rights of offenders. And unless we get that balance right, we're not going to get to a solution for you. I am so sorry for what you've suffered, and I hope we can make things better in the future.
Rhiannon Bragg, thank you very much for joining us today. And from all of us here, bye-bye.